What are the different types in JavaScript? Now in ECMAScript 5, the specification defines 6 different types in JavaScript. We have 5 primitive types and 1 non-primitive type. So in terms of the primitive types, we have Boolean, number, string, null, and undefined. And our non-primitive type, we have something called object. So for a Boolean, it would be something with a value of true or false. For a number, it could be an integer, perhaps 1, or a double, so 1.0. It could be a string, which you can use both double quotes or single quotes. It can be the type null, which you can get access to with the value null. It can be the type undefined, which has the value undefined. And finally, we can have an object, which we can define either as an object literal with the special curly braces notation, or we can create it by instantiating an object with new object. So those are the types that we have in JavaScript, and we can use a function in JavaScript called typeOf to be able to print out the type of a value. So the type of 1 is number, the type of a string A is string, the type of true is a Boolean. So also we can check for the type of undefined, which is the type undefined. And finally, we can check the type of null, which incorrectly is actually a type of object. Now, this is a problem. The type of null is actually null, but incorrectly JavaScript has been reporting that it's object. And it's been doing this for such a long time, the change can't really be reversed now without causing a number of problems. So unfortunately, the type of null is object, whereas it should be null. And of course, the type of object is object. So those are the different types we have available to us in JavaScript. A follow-on question to this, because really that is quite a simple question, but a follow-on question to this I might ask is, what's the difference between a dynamically typed language like JavaScript and a statically typed language like Java? So if we go back into our sources, and let me just delete here, and imagine here we're writing actual Java code. So if we were writing Java, we might define a string something like this. And this would create a variable called A. And in a statically typed language like Java, we tell Java this A will hold strings and only strings. And then we can tell Java that the variable A will hold the string moo. So in a statically typed language like Java, before the code is run, in fact, as you write the code, you have to specify exactly what types each variable will hold. So if later on you try to do something like this, this would in fact cause an error in Java, because Java would know that A can only hold strings and you tried to make A hold a number. Whereas in JavaScript, we can do something along these lines. So in JavaScript, we have a variable called A, but the type of the variable A is actually inferred by whatever value we've assigned to A. So currently, if we were to do type of A, this would result in a string. But then later on, we can change A and point it to 1. And then the type of A here is going to be a number. That's what we mean by a dynamically typed language like JavaScript. With JavaScript, the type of variables are determined dynamically at runtime when we actually run the application. Whereas in Java, the type of a variable is defined statically when we actually write the code for our application. So what's the advantage of one over the other? And I'd say there's not really a clear advantage of one over the other. They're both useful in different scenarios and in different situations. So with a dynamically typed language, you can get up and running very, very quickly. It's much easier to write a quick JavaScript application or a quick Python application, perhaps. And that's another dynamically typed language. It's quicker to get up and running with these languages, but you only really uncover problems in dynamically typed languages at runtime. That is to say, when the application is actually executed. If perhaps in our application logic, some function expected A to be a string, but we had somehow changed it to a number at some point in our execution, we would only discover this when we actually run the application, and perhaps it throws an error, or even worse, perhaps it causes an error in the program and then it just continues silently, leading on to bigger and worse errors later on down the road. Whereas with a statically typed language like Java, when we actually compile the application, the compiler itself will throw up an error if we make a variable hold the wrong type. So we can uncover problems very, very early on in our development cycle. But that comes at the expense of making our applications just a little bit harder to write. There's also other advantages to having statically typed languages. Some issues around memory management and performance can be more tightly controlled with statically typed languages versus dynamically typed languages. So another follow-on question I might ask here is something that I think is actually very important. So you would have noticed that intermixed in our primitive types here, we've got two types that perhaps mean, well, kind of the same thing really. We've got null and we've got undefined. We have two seemingly redundant ways to represent this concept of no value. But there is actually a subtle difference between both of those. So if in our application here, I was to declare a variable called a, and let's console log it. Now you can see I've actually not assigned a to a value, so it doesn't know what type a is. So if we actually refresh here, you can see it's printing out the string undefined for that console log line, because that's what JavaScript sets a to when it doesn't know the type of a, when a hasn't been initialized with another value. So undefined is used by JavaScript and means no value. It's used for uninitialized variables, so variables like a which have not been initialized with another value. It's used for missing parameters to functions, and it's used for unknown variables and unknown properties to things like the window object. So if we did window hello, which is not a non-existent property on the window object, it would again return undefined. So for me, undefined is a core JavaScript function. It's used by the JavaScript engine to inform you that this is either an uninitialized variable, it's either a parameter that's missing from the function parameters list, or it's perhaps an unknown property of an object. Whereas if we were to type var a is equal to null, and let's run that, the type of that is obviously null. But I would say null is used by programmers to indicate no value. The JavaScript engine will never set a value to null for you. It will always set it to undefined if it doesn't know what it is. Only a programmer will ever set, only a human being, I should say, will ever set the value of a variable to null. And I think that's a subtle but important distinction between undefined and null. Only a programmer will set null. A JavaScript engine will never set null for you. And another interesting fact regarding null and undefined, which I think is interesting coming from other statically typed languages. In a language like Java, for instance, if we wrote string a is equal to null, what we're saying here, and I know this is not valid JavaScript, but what we're saying here is there's a variable called a. It is a string variable, and the value of this variable is, we don't know what it is yet, so I'm going to set it to null. So in statically typed languages, null isn't a value in and of itself. It's actually the concept of an absence of a value. Whereas in JavaScript, null is an actual value. So if the same as 1 is a value, you could also say that null is a value. And we know null is a value because we can do type of null, and it has a type. Well, it should say null. The type of null is null, and the null type has one value and only one value, which is the string, which is the keyword null. And the same goes for undefined. Undefined is a value the same way as 1 is a value, the same way as 2 is a value. And undefined is also a type. So undefined, the type, has one value, which is called undefined. So I think, again, that's something that's a subtle but important distinction between null and undefined in JavaScript, especially when compared to other languages as well, where these null and undefined in other languages are just absence of values, whereas null and undefined in JavaScript are, each of them is an actual value with its own type. Basically, comparing null and undefined with the equals operator returns in true. In terms of that, they're equivalent. Now, related to before, we're not comparing types here. We're not comparing the type of null is not equal to the type of undefined. The value of null, which has a type of null, is equal to the value of undefined, which has a type of undefined.